What's going on, everybody? Samurai back here. We're going to be trying to do something a little bit different today. Obviously, Kaldheim is on the horizon, and I am looking at reviewing all the cards that have been spoiled so far. Today is January 20th. It was the last day of spoiler season, so we know all the cards that are going to be coming out in the new Kaldheim set. So the way that I'm going to be reviewing the cards is I'm going to try to review them by color. And as far as how I'm going to quantify my judgment of the card is I have a scale here in which I'm going to be using new staple, constructed playable, limited playable, and pack filler as my way of evaluating the different cards. So I think it's important to define what each of these means so that you guys as viewers understand why I'm giving cards the rating that I do. If I think a card is a new staple, I think it is a very well designed card for the colors that it is in and will likely see play in a lot of decks utilizing that color. Constructed playable cards are cards that I think have a place or a home in certain decks in constructed formats. So whether that be Commander, Standard, Modern Legacy, what have you, it has a home somewhere in some type of constructed deck. A limited playable card is something that I think is only going to be good or okay in a draft format, a card where you're not, or a format where you're not playing with pre-constructed decks. And finally, there's going to be pack fillers. Every set has these. These are cards that are so unimpressive, so bad, and so undervalued that they don't find a home in constructed or limited or really any type of format whatsoever. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the Kaldheim white card previews. So we're going to be going through these from common all the way through the mythic rares. So we're going to go and do all the commons, so that's where we're starting first. First card we're looking at is going to be Wings of the Cosmos. This is a 1 white instant speed spell that says target creature gets +1/+3 and gains flying until end of turn. You also untap it. So I think this is a limited playable card. I think it is just on the line of being constructed, like a constructed playable card. I can see it in maybe some sort of combat trick instant speed decks, maybe like a Feather the Redeemed commander deck might utilize something like this. The fact that it gives it flying until end of the turn I think is not that useful, but I think just giving a creature +1/+3 and untapping it for a surprise block in limited could get you a lot of value plays. So that's why I think it's going to be pretty good in limited, potential in constructed, but I just don't think it's quite there yet. Next card that we're looking at is going to be Warhorn Blast. You're going to be paying 4 and 1 white for another instant speed spell. This spell says creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. So this is the first card we're going to look at that has the Foretell mechanic. So any card with Foretell, you can pay 2 to have that card exiled face down, and then you can later cast it for its Foretell cost. So for Warhorn Blast, its Foretell cost is going to be 2 generic and then 1 white. So effectively you're still paying 5 mana. You can just pay 2 up front and then you pay 3 later. So what does that mean for this card? Truly, I think it's pack filler. Sure, you get a nice decent little anthem effect, but paying 5 mana for +2/+1, even if you can front load and offset some of that cost beforehand, I don't think it's going to cut it. I don't even think this is really very good in limited. I think if you have enough creatures on board to swing in, you're probably swinging in to end the game at that point anyway. So I think giving it +2/+1 is really not going to help you close out too many games. Really, you would want to play a card like this maybe as a surprise block, like if your opponent goes all in. That being said, it would be so much better if it was like +2/+4 or something like that, where you could make some value trades and your creatures would still survive afterwards. That +1 toughness is not going to result in you saving many of your creatures a lot of the time. So I think this is kind of a trap card, and I think it is pack filler. Next card we're looking at is going to be Story Seeker. This is a dwarf cleric creature. You pay 1 and a white for a 2/2 with lifelink. I think this falls into the same category as the last card that we looked like. I think it's pack filler. I think you're even going to be a little bit upset if you have to end up playing this card in limited. I don't think there's any real synergy for dwarves or clerics, so I think you're really just paying 2 for a 2/2 with lifelink, and I don't think that really cuts it in any of the formats. Next card is going to be Kaldheim Courser. We're playing 2 generic and 1 white for a Pegasus creature. This one has flying as well as a static effect that says artifact and enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. I think this is probably a limited playable card. However, I don't know if there's quite enough artifacts and enchantments that you're going to be able to utilize this fact a lot. That being said, paying 3 for a 2/2 flyer is not the end of the world in limited. I just don't think it's good enough to see constructed play. Getting that 1 less might be beneficial. I just don't. Generally, if you're running an artifact-based deck, you're not running it in white a lot of the time anyway, unless it's equipment. So maybe you could find a place for this in an equipment-based deck. I still don't think it's good enough. I think you have better alternatives. Next, we're looking at Revitalize. There's a reprint from this was just printed in one of the most recent sets. I want to maybe it was Core 2021 or even one of the more recent sets. Revitalize is 1 and a white for an instant speed spell. Gain 3 life and draw a card. This is a limited playable card. Any card where you're cycling is probably going to be decent enough to see play in limited. The fact that you gain 3 life is kind of menial, but it's not negligible, but it's very rarely going to make the difference in one of your games. But the fact that you can cycle the card makes it playable in limited at the very least. Next card, Stalwart Valkyrie, paying 3 and a white for an Angel Warrior creature. You may pay 1 generic and 1 white and exile a creature card from your graveyard rather than pay the spell's mana cost. So you're getting a mana discount if you exile a creature, so you're going to end up with a 2 mana flying 3/2. And to be honest, I think that's probably pretty good and limited. I don't know that even a 2 mana 3/2 is good enough to see constructed play. But I think by turn 4 in limited, a lot of the time, you'll probably have a creature in your graveyard, whether it was destroyed by battle, whether it was discarded for some reason or another, that you can probably often do this, which is going to be nice turn 4 play. Potential that you can really high roll and get this out on turn 2. I don't think that's really going to happen very often, but maybe if you have a turn 1 play that you can somehow get into the graveyard, having a 2 mana 3/2 flyer on turn 2 is going to be really good and limited. Next card we're looking at here is going to be Iron Verdict. This is 2 generic and 1 white for an instant speed spell that says Iron Verdict deals 5 damage to target tapped creature. It also has Foretell, so you can exile it for 2 and later pay 1 white to do the same effect. This card is horrible. This card is definitely pack filler. This card is... There are so many better cards. There are cards in white that just say destroy tapped creature. This says you have to deal that damage, and it still has to be a tapped creature. I don't think foretelling this makes it any better in any way. I think the only benefit that you could have to ever playing this card is you can foretell this card for 2 mana and maybe trick your opponents into thinking you foretelled something way better, because this card is so bad. I don't think this sees play ever in any format. Next card is Master Skald. This is 4 generic and 1 white for a dwarf warrior creature. It says when Master Skald enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do that, return target artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. I neglected to mention that this is a 4/4 creature. I think this is okay in limited. It's nice to have a little bit of graveyard recursion in limited. You also get it on a 4/4 body, and I don't think you have to jump through too many hoops to make this happen. The only issue is just making sure you're going to have an artifact or an enchantment creature to hit when you're playing in limited. I don't think this is good enough to play in constructed. I think it's too expensive for the cost. Generally, if you're wanting to interact with your graveyard, you're not doing it at 5 mana unless you're getting your entire graveyard back on the battlefield. So for that reason, I think limited playable, not quite to the level of being pack filler. Next card is God's Hall Guardian. We're paying 5 generic and a white for a cat creature who's a 3/6. He has Vigilance and Foretell. So you can pay 2 mana in advance, and then you can foretell the God's Hall Guardian out for 3 generic and 1 white. Again, this is not saving you any mana in any way. I think the only benefit you get is maybe foretelling it and tricking an opponent into thinking that you're foretelling a better card. I think a 6 mana 3/6 with vigilance is horrible. It's not even good if you not even good in limited. If you are paying 6 mana for a creature, it better have better stats than a 3/6, or it better have some sort of powerful effect that impacts the board immediately. Our next card is Bound in Gold, 2 generic and a white for an enchantment aura. It says enchant permanent. So this is anything. It's not just creatures, and it says enchanted permanent. Enchanted permanent can't attack, block, or accrue vehicles, and its activated abilities can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. So I feel like we've seen this card over and over again. It's our generic 3 mana white enchantment that pacifies or stops cards from doing things. I think you're going to be okay with getting this in limited. You can hit anything with it, which is cool. I don't think you're going to be using it on anything other than creatures very often. Yeah, that being said, you can still tap things with this. So if it's any sort of tap effect, it might need some clarification, but I think cards with tap effects might be able to still utilize their abilities. I think the only reason this card was printed is because it has the text on it that says or cruise vehicles, and apparently vehicles are a big theme in Kaldheim. So they basically had to print the new generic white mana spell that also stopped you from crewing vehicles. It's fine and limited. It's very close to being pack filler. Never seeing anything in constructed. Next we have a Giant Ox. You're paying 1 generic and a white for an Ox creature who's a 0/6. Just for the stat line, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. However, it has a effect that says Giant Ox crews vehicles using its toughness rather than its power. I think for that alone, this could be a constructed playable card if there is a deck that is designed around crewing vehicles. If there is one, somebody comes up with one, this card will see play in it. If it's not, I think it's probably pack filler. Maybe it sees play in some other type of deck that leverages the toughness to deal combat damage. I think it's high alert type decks. This might see play in a deck like that too. I think there's a home for it in constructed, but it has to be designed around. Next card, Doomscar Oracle, 2 generic and a white for a human cleric creature. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you gain 2 life. You can foretell this one as well. Pay 2 ahead of time, and you can pay a 1 white later. Pack filler, for sure. This card would probably be better in other colors. The issue with this card is it says, whenever you cast your second spell each turn. Issues that white are generally facing is card advantage. So an issue that you're going to have in white is you're going to play out all of your cards, have issues refilling your hand. When you don't have cards in hand, it's very difficult to play multiple cards per turn. You're going to play all your cards too early, especially if you're in an aggressive deck. You play Doomscar Oracle, you might have like 1 or 2 cards left in hand. Maybe you get this to trigger one time. And if you do get it to trigger, you're not that happy about it. You're only gaining 2 life. It doesn't really give you any significant impact for the amount of jumps that you have to jump through. The amount of hoops that you have to jump through in order to trigger this ability. So for that reason, I think this card's horrible. Doesn't see play in any format. Code Spell Cleric, 1 white mana for a human cleric creature who's a 1/1 with vigilance, who also says, when Code Spell Cleric enters the battlefield, if it was the second spell you cast this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. I think this, despite what I just said about playing multiple cards per turn, I think this can see playing constructed in some sort of aggressive white weenies type deck. It's a 1 mana effectively 2/2. It also has synergy with any sort of +1/+1 counters. I think there's a lot of times where you're going to go, if you're playing that type of deck, you'll have a turn 1 play, a turn 2 play, and then you can, on turn 3, you might play a 1/1 and this guy, or a 2/2 and this guy, and you're pretty happy about it because you're tacking on an additional 2/2 with pseudo vigilance. So I think this card's pretty good. It'll see play in some sort of white weenies constructed decks, probably something in standard. Next card is Beskir's Shieldmate, 1 generic and a white. When Beskir's Shieldmate dies, create a 1/1 white human warrior creature token. I think this probably sees play in limited. I don't think it's quite good enough to see play in constructed because it's a little bit slower than the code spell card that we just looked at before this. It doesn't give you any immediate effect on the board. It is effectively a 3/2 for 2 mana, which isn't terrible, but I think it just needs to do a little bit more before it sees any play in Constructed. I think you're really happy to get this one in Limited, however, because a 2 mana 3/2 in Limited is going to be pretty decent. Plus, it protects you against any sort of board wipes by giving you an additional 1/1. Next card is Axgard Braggart, 3 generic and a white dwarf warrior creature who has boast. So this is the first card we're looking at that has the boast effect. So in order to trigger a card's active boast ability, you have to attack with it that turn. So you can attack and immediately boast the card. To my understanding, you could boast a card multiple times. Nope, I didn't read the card. You can only do the boasting one time. That makes it so much worse. I think if you could boast multiple times a turn, this card would be okay. It still wouldn't be good, but I think it would be a chance. Obviously, they're just going to have to... It's a new mechanic, so they're going to be printing a lot of cards that say boast. Doesn't mean any of them are going to be good. And this is certainly not one. This is pack filler for sure. It's a 4-mana 3/3, and in order to make it a 4/4, you're paying 6 mana, and you can't even do that the turn you play it. So a 6 mana 4/4. I mean, you can untap it when you boast. I still don't think that's good. So you're effectively paying 6 mana for a 4/4 with Vigilance, but you can't even do that the turn you play it. So yeah, that's pack filler. Card's really bad. Next card, Invoke the Divine. 2 and a white for an instant that says destroy target artifact or enchantment and you gain 4 life. I think that this card is also pack filler. There are way cheaper spells that allow you to destroy artifacts or enchantments, and again, the fact that you're gaining 4 life is pretty menial, even in Limited. I will say I like the fact that it's at instant speed. A lot of these cards tend to be at sorcery speed. However, to pay 3 mana to destroy an artifact or enchantment, it's very expensive, and you can typically do it for a lot cheaper. Pack filler. Next card, Gold Maul Champion. We're paying 2 and 1 white to get a Dwarf Warrior creature who's a 2/3. This guy also has Boast. So same thing, you're going to pay 1 and a white to boast him, and it says tap target creature. So effectively what you want to do with this guy here is you're going to swing in, pay for his boast, and tap whatever's going to be blocking your creatures. I still think that's very expensive, and I think this guy's pack filler. There are better cards that can tap opponents' creatures, and you need to attack with this to do it. So if you're ever attacking into a board that has multiple large blockers, you're going to attack with this guy just so you can trigger his boast. However, they're just going to block it with something else, and you effectively paid 2 mana just to tap something. There are better ways to tap opponents' creatures, and you're not going to get a lot of recursion off this ability. Next card is Battlefield Raptor. 1 white for a bird creature who's a 1/2 and he has flying and first strike. I might be overvaluing this card, but I think this is a staple card. I think this will see play in pretty much any type of Azorius, Flyers, any sort of bird tribal, anything like that. Just paying 1 for a 1/2 flying and first strike is really good. I don't have really anything bad to say about this card. I'm surprised this isn't 2 mana. Typically, a card like this that has flying and an additional keyword are not seeing play at 1 mana. I think this card is great. I think it finds homes in a lot of different decks. So, first new staple that we're going to see for Kaldheim. Next card is Valor of the Worthy. We're paying 1 white for an enchantment that says enchant creature, and the enchanted creature gets +1/+1. When the enchanted creature leaves the battlefield, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. I think this can see play in Constructed because it costs 1 and it's effectively giving you 2/2, but it's split up so that when you lose the creature, you still get some of those stats left over. I think this card is really pretty nice. It gives you a bit of protection from battle and board wipes also, and plus it gives you that immediate effect of the +1/+1 for 1 when you play it. So I think this is a constructed playable card. It's also going to be good in Limited. Don't think it's good enough to be a staple, but I think that's a good card. Next card is Valkyrie's Sword. You pay 1 and a white for an artifact equipment. When Valkyrie's Sword enters the battlefield, you may pay 4 generic and a white. If you do, create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance, and then you attach the Valkyrie's Sword to it. Valkyrie's Sword also gives an equipped creature +2/+1, and you can equip it to another creature for 3 mana. This card is expensive. Everything about this card is expensive. If you're not essentially kickering it, and yeah, I don't understand why this card just doesn't say kicker, because that's effectively what you're doing, but I digress. So if you kicker it for 5, you get a 4/4 and you can attach the equipment to it. So you're basically going to get a 6/5 flyer with vigilance for 7 mana. Is that good enough for constructed? There's no chance that's good enough for constructed. If you're paying 7 mana, you're going to want to impact the board way more than that. However, I think in limited, although it's very, very expensive, you're okay. You're happy enough paying 7 mana for a 6/5 flyer with vigilance. It's going to be really difficult for your opponent to deal with in limited. So for that reason, it narrowly misses the pack filler mark. Our next card is Usher of the Fallen, another 1 white mana creature spirit warrior. This card also has Boast. Pay 1 and a white, and when you boast it, you can create a 1/1 white human creature token. So this is a 2/1 that you can boast and make an additional 1/1. It wants to be played in a white weenie type deck, especially if you get a bad white weenie hand. So if you play this guy out on 1, or girl, I think it's probably looks like it's a girl based on the art. Anyway, you play it on turn 1. If you don't have a good turn 2 play, you can still attack and you can boast it. Your opponent's not going to be able to block this a lot of the time because it's a 2/1. They're usually not going to get a good trade if they have anything on the board. So it gives you a way to still have a turn 2 play. Additionally, later in the game, you can just attack in with it, and you can get that 1/1 white human creature token. So interestingly enough, this card, I don't know if they just didn't feel the need to explain it all out like they did on the first boast card that we looked at, but it doesn't say that this has to be activated only once per turn. But I think all boast cards are the same way. You activate it when they're attacking. You can only do that once per turn. If you could pay additional mana to do this multiple times, again, the card would be pretty good. The fact that you don't do it makes it less good. I think it's still decent enough to see some play in some types of constructed decks. Next card is Spectral Seal. Spectral Steel. 1 generic and 1 white for an enchantment creature. For an enchantment aura that enchants a creature. And the enchanted creature gets +2/+2. So right off the back, we're paying 2 mana, David creature, +2/+2. Not great. However, it gets a lot better when you read the rest of the card and it says 1 generic and 1 white, exile Spectral Steel from your graveyard. When you do that, you return another target aura or equipment card from your graveyard to your hand. This card is really good, and it kind of does a good job of exemplifying a point that I made earlier in the video, that when you want to interact with your graveyard, you want to do it for very few mana, 1 mana, 2 mana. I think the fact that you can pay 2 mana after this card has already seen decent enough value, then interact with your graveyard, giving you more value by getting back a different aura or a different piece of equipment, makes this, I think, a staple card. You get the buff immediately. Inevitably, you're going to lose that creature, and this goes to the graveyard. But then you get graveyard recursion on top of that. I think the fact that you don't get Spectral Steel, and you exile it to get a different card, I think makes it even better, because getting back another enchantment that just gives you +2/+2 that's not the card that you're going to be looking to get back out of your graveyard. You're going to look to get a better enchantment, a better aura, or better equipment, and I think this gives you a way to do that without having to pay an additional card to do that. I think this is really good. It's a staple card for white. Awesome card. Next is Shepherd of the Cosmos, 4 generic and 2 white for an angel warrior creature that has flying. It also says, when Shepherd of the Cosmos enters the battlefield, return target permanent card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can also foretell this one. I'm just going to go ahead and preface probably the rest of these views with the fact that I don't think the foretell mana mechanic is really that powerful. I think it's okay, and maybe a little bit better in like Commander, where you have a lot more additional mana floating around, but it's hard to have all that excess mana sitting around to just foretell the card beforehand and play it later. again, it's not you're not even getting a discount on the card's mana cost. All right, I'm gonna get off my soapbox. So, what do I think about this card? Don't think it's great. I think it's fine and limited, but I won't see any sort of constructed play. You play this guy on turn 6. I think often enough on turn 6 you'll have a card with CMC 2 or less in the graveyard. So you're almost always going to get that effect to go off. So you're going to get a 3/3 flyer, get something back. Maybe it'll be, I don't know, a mana rock. Maybe it'll be another creature that gives you an ETB, ideally, to get the most value out of it. Again, not good enough to see constructed play, and narrowly misses being pack filler. Next card, Rune of Sustenance. This is an enchantment or a rune. This is the first rune that we're seeing. I believe every color is getting at least one of these runes. It says enchant permanent, so not just creatures, any permanent. When Rune of Sustenance enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So immediately it's a 2 mana cycle, not too bad. Additionally, it says as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it has lifelink. And as long as enchanted permanent is an equipment, because again, you don't have to just enchant the creature, you can enchant an equipment. Or another enchantment, I guess. I don't know. I don't know why you would ever do that, but I guess you could do it. But if you put it on an equipment, it will say equipped creature also has lifelink in addition to whatever other text that equipment has. I think it's fine and limited. I don't think it's good enough to see constructed play. I think you're really mostly paying this just as a 2 mana cycle. I think the additional stuff this card is very comparable to Revitalize, the card that we looked at before, where you just pay 2 mana to cycle a card and you get 3 additional life. I think often enough you're probably just going to put this, if you can put it on a creature, for example, maybe like a 3/3 3/4, you're going to swing in with it. Maybe it'll trade, maybe you'll get a couple attacks off of it. So maybe you'll gain more than 3 life, so maybe it's a little bit better than Revitalize, but it's definitely never good enough to see constructed play, I don't believe. I think this also has drawbacks, because Revitalize you can just play anytime and at instant speed. You have to have a permanent. Well, actually, I don't even think it's a drawback now. The thing it just says enchant permanent. You could put this on a land. It doesn't say non-land permanent, so you're always going to have a target for it. I still think Revitalize is probably better. Next card is Kaya's Onslaught. You're paying 2 generic and 1 white for an instant that says target creature gets +1/+1 and gains double strike until end of turn. We have another Foretell card. You're gonna pay the 2. You can play this card later at instant speed for 1 white pip. This card is probably okay in limited. Every once in a while you might steal a game with this if you instant speed this onto like a 5/5 that you're attacking in, and you're just swinging in with a 6/6 with double strike to do 12 damage. It might steal a game every once in a while. I don't think it's good enough to see constructed play, and it's certainly not a staple. But I think it steals enough games in limited that it's not quite pack filler. So now we've come to Divine Gambit, the meme card of the set. A lot of people have been talking about this one. Divine Gambit is 2 white pips for a sorcery that says exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment an opponent controls. If it just said that, it'd be great. However, if you keep reading the card, it then says the player who loses the exiled card gets to put a permanent from their hand onto the battlefield. So what's the worst case scenario with this card? You Divine Gambit on turn 2, your opponent's really good 2-drop. They turn around and put a 6 or 7 CMC creature onto the battlefield that you can't deal with, and then you just immediately lose. I think initially you want to say that this card is pack filler, because I think the low rolls on it are so bad it just loses you the game immediately. But I think it does have a small space in limited, because limited games will often drag on to the point where you're in a top deck war. And if you can play this card when your opponent has no cards in hand, it mitigates the drawback that this card has when you play it. So your opponent, you're both top decking your opponent, they get a 5 mana 6/6 and they throw it down. What a great top deck. You then play Divine Gambit, so you effectively destroy their 6/6 for 2 mana, and they have no hand, so they can't put that permanent back into the battlefield. It's not always going to happen, but I think it can happen enough only in limited. This doesn't ever happen in constructed or any of the other formats probably, but in limited, it's not the worst thing, and again, it narrowly misses being a pack filler. Next card's Clarion Spirit. It's 1 and a white for a spirit creature that's a 2/2. It says, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So we had talked about this earlier, where the big drawback of this card is it's counterintuitive to what white is typically trying to do. White is often not playing a ton of cards every single turn. And when they do, it's hard for them to do that multiple turns in a row because card draw is such a weakness in white. However, I think there are a few constructed decks that can probably utilize this card. I had mentioned like a Feather Redeemed deck where you're getting a lot of value by playing those really, really cheap combat tricks over and over again, multiple per turns. If you're able to do that and you have this on the field, you get an additional white 1/1 every single time you do it, as well as just having a 2/2 body on the field. I think there's a couple decks where this could see play. I don't think it's great, and interestingly enough, I think this card is actually worse in limited because you're almost never going to get that trigger off in limited. Even if you do, it's not going to win you the game or anything like that. So I think it's constructed playable just because there's a few decks that I can think of that might be able to utilize it. Next card is Battershield Warrior. 2 and a white for a human warrior creature with boast. Here we're seeing that boast again. Here, this card has, I don't understand. It has the clarification text on it, but the other one didn't. I don't know, whatever. So when you boast this one, it says creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So you have to pay 3 mana, wait a turn, and then attack unless you somehow give this haste. And then you play an additional 2 mana to get a 1/1 Anthem effect. So you're effectively paying 5 mana for a Glorious Anthem that you have to wait a turn to do, and you can only do it when Battershield Warrior attacks. Yeah, no way around it. This card is definitely pack filler. If you want this effect, you're just going to play Glorious Anthem or any of the other Anthem effects that are going to give you global boost to your creatures. This card's horrible, and you have to jump through way too many hoops to get a very underwhelming effect. So we're finally on to our rares, and then we'll be on to the mythics. But the first rare that we're looking at is Sigrid, God Favored. 1 and 2 white for a legendary creature that is a human warrior and has 2 power and 2 toughness. This card has Flash. It also has First Strike, and it has protection from god creatures. I don't know how often that's going to matter, but it's interesting. So the effect of Sigrid is when Sigrid, God Favored, enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target attacking or blocking creature until Sigrid leaves the battlefield. So this card is very similar to those other 3 mana enchantment removals that white is so used to seeing. This has the additional effect that you get a 2/2 body that has First Strike and you can flash it in. I think the fact that you can flash in Sigrid makes her a lot better because you can do it to surprise your opponent if they're attacking in with a big creature. I think the fact though that this effect is on a creature makes it worse because it's easier to remove than when you play a similar card that's on with an effect that's an enchantment. Regardless, I think this card is pretty cool. I think it can see play in some constructed deck. I think since a card like Skyclave Apparition is seeing a lot of play in constructed, and that's effectively something very similar. It's a 3 mana on a 2/2 body that can exile a creature. Skyclave's a little bit better because you can exile anything. But I think Sigrid is cool, and the fact that you have Flash can make it cool, and I think it'll probably see some play in some decks. Our next card is Runeforged Champion, 2 and a white for a Dwarf Warrior creature who is a 2/3. It says, when Runeforged Champion enters the battlefield, you may search your library and your graveyard for a rune card. So we saw the one rune earlier, it was the Rune of Sustenance. It was the card that lets you cycle and enchant something to give it lifelink. So you can take one of those runes from your deck or your graveyard, and you then put it back into your hand. If you search your library to do it, you then have to shuffle. You can then pay just 1 mana to play the rune instead of the 2. This card would be awesome if the rune was good. Obviously, we haven't looked at the other colors' runes yet, but looking at just Rune of Sustenance and the fact that in order to utilize any other runes colors, you'd also have to be playing in those colors, makes this card really, really bad. If the rune was great, this card would be great. The fact that the rune is not good makes this card really bad. And there's no retroactiveness with this card. There were no rune type cards previously printed. I already looked. So it specifically has to say rune in the card type. And you can't just like, I don't know, get like a one of the key runes artifacts or something like that. You can't search that. It specifically has to say rune in the card type. So unfortunately that makes Runeforge champion terrible. Next card is Righteous Valkyrie. 2 generic and 1 white for an angel cleric creature who is a 2/4 with flying. Whenever another angel or cleric enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. Pretty cool. It also says as long as you have at least 7 life more than your starting life total, creatures you control get +2/+2. This card's awesome. I think there's a ton of constructed decks that can utilize this. Um, it has the one drawback of you only get that initial trigger when it's an angel or a cleric being played. So if you want to utilize that, you have to be playing in some sort of angel tribal or heavily themed angel deck. But I think there's enough like commander decks and other constructed decks based around angels that you can utilize that. If you happen to gain enough life that you get over 7 life total, you get a +2/+2 to all of your creatures. And I don't think that's anything to scoff at, and the fact that this is a 3 mana 2/4 with flying, that alone makes this a good card. So all these other effects on the card is just a bonus on top of that. So I think Righteous Valkyrie is a really good card. Next is going to be Rally the Ranks. 1 and a white for an enchantment. This enchantment says, as Rally the Ranks enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. This is a staple. This card is so good. Any tribal deck that you are playing that has white is almost always going to run this card. You cannot I think it's really easy to underestimate how powerful it is to pay 2 mana to get a global +1/+1 on all your tribal creatures. This card is awesome. You get the Anthem effect for discounted mana, and it is a little bit more limited than a card like Glorious Anthem, because Glorious Anthem hit any of your creatures, but if you're playing a tribal deck, honestly, you probably just play both of them at that point, if it's creature focused or combat focused, but this card is really good at the 2 mana cost in any sort of tribal deck. Definitely a staple in white tribal decks. Next card is Search for Glory. 2 and a white for a snow sorcery. This is the first white card we've seen with the snow type. It says, search your library for a snow permanent card, a legendary card, or a saga card. You then reveal it, put it into your hand, shuffle your library. You additionally gain 1 life for each snow permanent, or well, snow mana on a land permanent, obviously, spent to cast this spell. So I think this is cool. I think this is a constructed playable card. I don't know if there's going to be enough snow support to have an entire deck based around snow. It might just be something sprinkled in here or there. I think it's just a pretty decent tutor, even without all the additional snow like stuff tacked onto it. Just tutoring, 3 mana tutoring for a legendary card or maybe even a saga is not bad. I think this can see play in a decent amount of constructed decks. I'm thinking more specifically for Commander, where the format's a little bit slower. I think this is probably not going to see play in like Standard, but Commander I can see this being utilized. And if you gain a couple life off of it too, additional bonus. Next card is Glorious Protector. 2 generic and 2 white for a 3/4 Angel Cleric that has Flash and Flying. It says when Glorious Protector enters the battlefield, you may exile any number of non-angel creatures you control until Glorious Protector leaves the battlefield. You can also foretell this card. We haven't seen foretell in the last couple of cards, interestingly enough. So you pay 2, and then later you can pay 2 and a white. So overall you're paying 5 mana, but I think this card is really better than it looks, and I think it looks pretty good because just 3 mana for a 3/4 Flash Flying isn't that bad, but I think it has niche use. If you just want it for the body, you more or less have to play it when you have no cards on the field, or else you're going to be regressing your board because you're going to have to exile those non-angel cards unless you're playing in an, I don't know, angel tribal deck, so you can navigate that risk. But I think where this card really shines is you foretell it for 2. So you have it sitting in exile. You're waiting, you're waiting, you're waiting. until the right time to play it. The right time to play it is when your board state gets really big and your opponent finally decides to Wrath and wipe your board. What you do is you pay the 3 mana, you flash this guy in, exile all the other creatures on your field, you lose only Glorious Protector, and then after he dies, the rest of your board comes back in the original state without losing your creatures. I think that can happen. You have to plan around it and you have to build around it, but when that happens, that just wins you the game, I think, almost every time, and for that reason, I think it's a constructed playable card. Next card is Doomscar. What a cool name for a card. 3 generic and 2 whites for a sorcery. It says destroy all creatures. So we were just talking about wrath effects, and interestingly enough, like that type of card being played is when you want to play Glorious Protector. But anyway, so is Doomscar good? Well, I think it gets a lot better for the fact that you can foretell it. So you pay 2, you sit it in exile, and then later you pay 3 mana to Wrath the entire board. I think this card is really good because in a lot of decks, especially, and I'm going to keep going to Commander. So in a lot of games like Commander, you're going to want to reset the entire board. And the fact that you can this is one of the few times where I think front loading or offsetting the cost by paying some of it early has a huge benefit. Because ahead of time, at some point you're going to need to reset the board. So you're okay investing that 2 mana because there's going to be a payoff when you inevitably play this card to wipe the board. Especially when you're in white, because you can't ramp too well unless you also are playing in green. So you're almost always going to be behind. So you get the most benefit from resetting the board because you're destroying more of your opponent's creatures and you hopefully have, more stuff sitting in hand. So awesome card. I think it's a staple card. I think it's going to be seeing play in a lot of different decks. Next card is Kaldheim Aspirant. 2 and a white for a creature human cleric. It says angel spells you cast cost 2 less to cast, and it's a 2/2. I think this is constructed playable in any sort of Angel Tribal deck. I don't think there's any other way to explain this card. It's terrible in anything else that's not Angel Tribal, obviously, but I think there's probably enough Angel decks that would want to run a card like this. If you can play this and then play, 2, 3 Angels, and you can get 4 or 6 mana discount, you're getting tons of value off of this. So here we're finally looking at our first Mythic. This is the Resplendent Marshal, 1 and 2 white for a flying 3/3 Angel Warrior creature. It says when Resplendent Marshal enters the battlefield or dies, you may exile another creature card from your graveyard. If you do that, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control other than Resplendent Angel that shares a creature type with the exile card. So that's a mouthful. This card is a wall of text. However, I think it's really pretty good. This is another card where you're probably going to want to play it in. Obviously, they're pushing the Angel Tribal thing here pretty hard, but I think it's pretty good in any sort of Tribal deck. This card, interestingly enough, reminds me a lot of a card like the Ozolith, where you can kind of offset the fact that you lost something. So you lost a creature at some point and it went to the graveyard, but now you're going to play Resplendent Angel, so you exile it and you get some value out of the card that you've already lost by putting counters on the other cards that you already have on the battlefield. And the fact that you can trigger this twice makes it a little bit better. You do it once when it comes into play, and you do it again if it dies. With that being said, I think this is most often only going to die when the board gets wiped. No one's going to go out of their way specifically to target this card, because when they do, you're going to get an added effect out of it. So you can also leverage that in a little bit, because if you're playing any sort of equipment or enchantments, you might want to play it onto this card, because your opponent is not going to want to remove Resplendent Angel because of the inevitability of you exiling that other creature and buffing your board up even more. So I think this is a constructed playable card. I don't think it's quite good enough to be a staple. I could be wrong though, because I think in tribal decks this is going to look pretty good. There's just other cards that you might rather run, but it's close. This is very close to being a staple card, I think. So now we're on to Rydane, God of the Worthy, who is a modal-faced legendary creature god. So on the front, she's 2 and a white for a 2/3, flying and vigilance. She says, snow lands your opponent control, enter the battlefield, tapped. So I'm just going to stop there and talk about that. How often is that going to matter? Probably not a lot. That might matter more in limited. I don't think it's going to matter a ton in constructed, but in limited, if that happens once or twice, you're pretty happy because it's going to get you ahead in the board state. Then the rest of the card says non-creature spells your opponent cast with converted mana cost 4 or greater cost 2 more to cast. So if your opponent wants to play anything that costs 4 or more, you're taxing them with an additional 2 mana to make that happen. So that's really interesting. We haven't seen any other cards in this set that have really played on that white taxing effect. So let's read the back face of the card before we say how good we think the card is. So on the back, it's Valkmira, Protector's Shield. So the legendary artifact card side of the card says you pay 3 generic and a white, and if a source an opponent controls would deal damage to you or a permanent you control, prevent 1 of that damage. Additionally, whenever you or another permanent you control become the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you immediately counter the spell or the ability unless its controller pays 1. So that's really interesting, and again, so both the front and the back of this card are playing on that taxing effect. I think this is played in some constructed decks, and I think this is more of a meta pick than anything else. If you're playing in a meta where there's lots of snowlands, lots of expensive cards, playing the front side Rydane is really good. If you're playing in any sort of meta where there's a lot of 1 damage and pings being thrown around, or a lot of targeted removal and spells, Valkmir Protector's Shield side seems pretty good. So I think you have to really pick and choose. This could even be seen as like a sideboarding card, depending if you're playing in best of 3 and your opponent's utilizing a lot of those different mechanics. It makes it a lot better. You have to know your meta, and I think in certain metas this card's an all-star. I think in other metas you don't get any value off of so many of these abilities that it makes it a pretty mediocre card. So know your meta and know when this card is going to shine, and it's going to be an MVP for you. I just don't think it's a staple because it's not good all the time. It's only good in certain circumstances. And I think this is the last card we're going to be looking at, Halvar, God of Battle. He's 2 generic and 2 white for a legendary creature god who is a 4/4. He said creatures you control that are enchanted or equipped have double strike. Double strike's a pretty powerful effect, so getting free double strike on stuff is, you can leverage that in a lot of ways because double strike can be hard to deal with when you're attacking. He also says at the beginning of each combat, you may attach target aura or equipment attached to a creature you already control to another target creature that you control. So this is interesting. Again, I want to read the backside of the card before we give our full judgment. So let's go to the backside, which is Sword of the Realms. So Sword of the Realms is a legendary artifact equipment that you pay 1 and a white for. It says equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has vigilance. Whenever equipped creature dies, return it to its owner's hand. You have to pay an additional 1 and a white to equip it. I think the Sword of the Realms side of this card is very underwhelming. You're paying 4 mana to give a creature +2/+0 and vigilance, and the fact that it gets to go back to your hand after it dies. It's not even like it just returns it to the battlefield. I think if it returned it to the battlefield, this card would be in contention for being pretty decent. But the fact that it doesn't do that makes it so much worse. So what do we think about this card? I originally put it as a new staple because I think it's really, really cool in aura decks, equipment decks, enchantment decks, anything like that. I think interestingly enough, the best part of this card is the very first thing that we read that says, creatures you control that are enchanted or equipped have double strike. I think the additional effect of equipping auras and equipments would be so good if it didn't have to already be equipped or attached to another one of your creatures. This card would be on another level if it said that. because I can just imagine you play, you can just attach your Colossus Hammer to whatever you want. But playing this card alongside other cards that do have that effect of equipping things for free makes it so much better. So I think this card is a staple card in those types of decks that are designed around equipment, enchantments, and auras, and attacking a lot, because the fact that you're going to be giving everything double strike is a huge buff to the cards that you're attacking in. And I think you're probably never playing the Sword of the Realms side of this card, because I think that side is like really pretty mediocre. However, Halvar God of the Battle side, staple in those types of decks. So that's going to be it. That's the last card in white that we're going to be looking at. I definitely want to do the other colors. I want to do the multicolored cards, the colorless cards also. We could take a look at the land cycle too. So let me know what you think about this. If you enjoyed this, if you want to see more, this is probably going to be a pretty long video. I wanted to try to keep talking about each card to like less than a minute. But some cards you have to devote a little bit more time than some of the pack filler cards. Obviously, you can skip over really quite quickly. Anyway, yeah, but like I said, just let me know what you think about this, and if you'd like to see me review the rest of the cards, I'm really excited to do that and check out the entire set. It's only, another week and a half till we'll be able to play with the cards ourselves. So until then, you guys take care, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thanks.